Kia ora, welcome to Under the Checkered Flag, MotoGP edition. I'm your host Kate, and we're just going to jump right in. Before we jump into recapping the Qatar race, I know, finally, we have seen some racing. Before I get into that, along with PozzA, I want to chat about how at the golden hour, they decided to change the tyre pressure rules. So I think it's good news, obviously, because it means we aren't going to be seeing disqualifications. But also it shows that the whole thing was flawed to begin with. And it is quite frustrating that, this is happening. Admittedly, it's not all completely Michelin's fault. The aerodynamics and everything are partly to blame. But what happened is the minimum tyre pressure has been changed to 1.8 bar from 1.88 bar. All the riders and teams that have been spoken to seem to have a positive view on this change. They've also brought in a change regarding the penalties. As I said just before, they're no longer going to be disqualifying riders who are in breach of the rule. The penalties that will be handed out, we could say, are huge time penalties still though. So it is 8 seconds in the sprint and 16 seconds in a Grand Prix race. So these are time penalties that clearly could still have absolutely massive implications for the World Championship. It's still going to be interesting to see how it plays out. I am glad this rule has changed. Even though we still have to have this rule, it's, unfortunate, but at least now we're not going to be seeing those disqualifications. So now I've got my tyre nerdiness out of the way, let's jump in to Qatar, because we didn't just see one great race, we saw 3 out of 4 great races. I say 3 out of 4 because personally I think if it wasn't for Pedro Acosta, that Grand Prix wouldn't have been nearly as fun. Fortunately, Pedro is on the grid, but getting way ahead of ourselves, let's start with Moto3. So, we are just going to cover some predictions that we may or may not have forgotten to cover last time, which was totally my fault. So I'll start with mine and then I'll pass over to PozzA so he can say his. And to start up, we've gone with the Rookie of the Year for Moto3 and Moto2. So in I'm just going to say that we did this before this weekend, because in Moto3, I've gone for David Almanza, and obviously now it looks like he's probably out for a while, so maybe a bad move on my part. But for Moto2, I've gone for Diogo Moreira. Who have you gone with?
Obviously, I did start thinking of mine after the first race, so I might have been influenced by that a bit. But for Moto 3, I've gone on the Tech 3 for Jacob Ralston. Also, probably influenced by him being Australian. Might be a bit biased there, but he's with, you'd say, one of the top 4 or 5 teams. Yeah, he can probably pick up a bit from Danny Holgado, take in a bit of experience, bit of knowledge. And no surprises for Moto 2. I've gone with Dennis Onchu. Obviously, being with probably the best team in Moto 2 at the minute. But even apart from that, just during testing, he was looking pretty comfortable compared to most of the other rookies. I do think it'll be close between him and Senna Agius, though, just because Agius has been on a Moto2 bike before, and obviously coming from European Moto2 Championship.
You made that sound far more logical than I wanted it to be, so I can't even rip into you about just being a Dennis Onchu fanboy. Sorry, hold
Put
on,
some
Lewis
thought
is
into
just
it.
having a tantrum. So, moving on to what many people are calling the Japanese Cup. I thought we'd do a prediction for this as well. So this is basically a secondary championship that people are joking is running within the MotoGP championship. And it's basically who do you think is going to be the best Japanese rider? You can go first on this one.
Obviously, with Yamaha and the Repsol Hondas on the factory bikes, uh, they might have a bit of an edge throughout the season, but I was personally thinking it was between sort of Zarco, Quattararo, and maybe Mir, but in the end, I've gone with Zarco just because he looks pretty comfortable with the bike, and that's it really. If everyone stays fit.
Yeah, we don't need a repeat of the injury that we saw at Honda or Yamaha last year. Goodness knows there were enough of them. I also tossed up with Zarco, Mir, and Quattararo, but for me, Quattararo ended up coming out on top just because he's got the most experience on the bike that he's actually on, so probably knows it the best. And that's pretty much why I went for him in the end. Again, I made this prediction before the race that had just been, and the fact he did finish highest, I'm quite glad about because it does make me feel a little bit better. But yeah, so let's talk about the weekend's racing. Starting with Moto3, I do want to shout out your prediction for Rookie of the Year because Jacob Ralston came out really strongly. I think he ended up finishing in, I believe it was P10. That, and he is Australian, so I am going to fangirl him a bit because down under gang. But it was just a very, very impressive performance. In the end, the podium was Tayo Furasato, Danny Holgado, and David Alonso. I do kind of feel a little bit bad for Danny Holgado because he put on such an impressive race, only for Alonso to clinch it so close to the end of the race. And it was just, yeah, really quite impressive from both of them. And for Rosado as well, from memory, he came up from like P18 or something, which is just absolutely bonkers. And yeah, really great performances by all of them. The only other thing I really want to talk about is the fact that there was like a lot of crashes. So we saw three big crashes where people took each other out, sort of thing. I did a terrible job of explaining that. Basically, one rider fell and took another rider out with them, and it was just, yeah. So the main one was Rueda and Otola because they were fighting right at the front and they fell quite early, which was quite interesting. Fortunately for Otola, he did manage to limit the damage to P9. Um, but with Rueda, this is the worst possible start to the championship that I think he could have had, obviously. Fortunately, he doesn't seem to be injured, so hopefully he'll come back because, yeah, I do expect him to be up there and fighting for the championship. What are your thoughts on the Moto3 race?
Something that I noticed with all of the crashes, the multi-rider crashes, and sort of just across the whole weekend in general, was there was a lot of high sides. Um, like all three of the multi-rider crashes were pretty much high sides that collected riders who just couldn't get out the way. Um, and obviously this will be covered in Moto 2, but maybe it's just something with the Pirellis that they spin up a little bit easier, um, and just chew up the rear tires a bit. Um, Apart from that, just wanted to give a shout out to some of the other rookies. Obviously behind Ralston there was Joel Esteban and Piqueras. So yeah, it's good to see some of the rookies up there fighting for points. Moving on to Moto 2, um, just jump right in with the podium. There was Sergio Garcia for empty helmets, Barry Baltus, and Alonso Lopez was the winner. Um, Something that you notice straight away with Aguro in fourth is that the Boscoscuro chassis look a bit more competitive this year than they have been in the past. Obviously, the only rider missing out of that was Aldeguer, but that was a separate problem. Um, a big theme throughout the race seemed to be mainly the medium tyre runners for the rear tyre. Sort of like 8-10 laps in, their whole pace pretty much just fell off. Um, Ethan Guevara, that's another one, who pulled in to retire after 12 laps. So, like I said before, it might just be something with the Pirellis that they spin up a bit easier, chew through the rear tyres. Um, any thoughts on your end?
It's interesting you mentioned Guevara because over the world feed, I think it was Simon Patterson said that Guevara was having trouble with the tyres from lap 5, which obviously there was major issues with the tyres because the names that you expect to be up there fighting just dropped like, you know, stones basically. Tony Arbolino finishing P20, Firmin Aldeguer finishing P16. It's just, yeah, you didn't expect it. And it'll be interesting to see, you know, if some of them are running the same tyres next week or if they just, yeah, just straight up don't run the medium rears for a while. I do think a big factor in it was the fact that they hadn't been able to test the tyres really because of the changed format. Well, not the changed format. They didn't change the format. They changed it for MotoGP, but for Moto2, next to no one will have, you know, had full running time because of the rain and how no one actually went out. So, yeah, I think that was a big player in it. And obviously, I'm quite devastated because I think this is probably Kinet's best chance of a win. Um, and his tyres totally screwed him. So, heartbreak, total heartbreak.
Something else that I noticed was in the early laps, I think Canet, Arbolino, and Guevara all had like near high sides with rear tire letting go. So I wonder if that just sort of contributed to their rear tire disappearing very quickly.
That's interesting because it definitely could contribute to it.
Also, shout out to Dennis Onchu for scoring his first points in Moto 2.
I'm surprised that wasn't the first thing you said, to be fair. I thought it was going to be straight in there with the Dennis facts. Maybe next time. Or maybe when he wins, you know, next year.
Oh, it'll be the first thing I say when he wins. If he
Yeah,
wins.
that'll be the opening to the podcast. Just excited PozzA noises. Alrighty, moving on to MotoGP. So, starting with the sprint, I have to admit, I'm glad we got an exciting sprint because I didn't really consider the race to be overly exciting. But the podium for the sprint was Alicia Spargaro in P3, Brad Binder in P2, and Jorge Martin in first place. And yeah, it was quite a fun race. I was very impressed with how close it was in the end. I say close, it was 1 second between the top three riders. Pecco Bagnaia is in P4, and I feel like he would have been quite disappointed with his performance on the Saturday. But he did say, and so did Enea Bastianini, that they were experiencing a chatter. They do seem to have got rid of that on the Sunday, but I'm not 100% sure. And obviously, the notable mention for this weekend has got to be Pedro Acosta because he finished PA in the P8 in the sprint, and for a rookie, that's just downright impressive. I do worry about his teammate Augusto Fernandez because he finished down in P18, and that's really got to be a little bit humbling to be so outscored by Acosta. But Acosta is just a natural talent, you know.
I sort of feel a bit more for Jack Miller as well, being the factory rider. Um, again, this weekend just seemed like he got a pretty good start, but after a few laps, his tires just sort of disappeared again. Um, Acosta did the same thing in the race, to be fair, but being a rookie and all, he's a bit more excused. Um, yeah, no. Apart from that, I don't really remember the sprint, honestly.
Is that because you were so enthralled by the main race, or?
I don't know. Probably just the fact that it was like 4 days ago now.
Yeah, it does fade quite quickly. I was quite fortunate that obviously we got delayed from recording last night. So in the end today, I just went and rewatched Moto3 and Moto2 so that it was a lot more fresh in my mind. And even though we've stopped talking about Moto2, Sasaki's crash actually was pretty darn terrifying. And he ends up jumping off the bike, otherwise, he will go into like the air fence at full speed, and that was just totally freaky. So that was one thing that stuck out from rewatching it. The joys of Video Pass.
Moving on to the main race for MotoGP. Um, this is probably a podium we're going to get quite used to seeing in some order. It was Jorge Martin in P3, Brad Binder came second on the KTM, and Pecco Bagnaia. I don't really want to say he dominated, but he led pretty much from start to finish. I think he actually made any mistakes. If he can keep this type of performance up for the rest of the season, it it could be very hard for the others to beat him. Um, Aside from that, again, Pedro Acosta. As I mentioned before, he was up there for first half, three quarters of the race, um, fighting with mainly Mark Marquez. Just chewed the tires up a bit too much, was probably pushing a bit too hard, but throughout the year, as he gains more experience, shouldn't be a problem again. Any thoughts on your side?
I guess the only thing I would probably want to talk about, being the total Marc Marquez fangirl I am, is this was his debut on a Ducati. He came P5 in the sprint and P4 in the main race. And like you said, if Pedro hadn't been battling with him, I think Mark would have been able to conserve his tyres a bit more because what we saw, I think it was with 3 or so laps to go, Mark put the hammer down a bit and started gaining to Jorge Martin quite quickly, I suppose. But it does look like he overcooked his tyres, probably from that battle. And so, yeah, that sucks for Mark because a debut podium would have been very 2013-esque and I would have got quite excited. But I do think, coming into Coda in a few weeks, he's got to be the favourite for winning that. And yeah, I do think it'll be quite interesting to watch how he adapts to that Ducati. And yeah, it was just a really good weekend overall for Grassini because his brother finished 2 places behind him in both races, which I found really funny because Alex Marquez's number is like 2 behind Marc Marquez. I know it's 20, but still, I found it humorous for no apparent reason. And we probably should, because we've done our Japanese Cup predictions, just shout out to Fabio Quartararo, who did finish, you know, P11 it was. Definitely should have had the results up before I said this. P11 in the Grand Prix and P12 in the sprint. So he was the top Japanese rider on both days, which bodes well for my predictions, at least.
The top three we all outlined finished right behind each other in the race, so
Yeah, yeah. It was very much a Japanese battle because it does look like that they all. I mean, Zarco in the race finished 18 seconds and 0.075, and Mir was less than 4 hundredths behind him. So I do wish we got to see more of those, middle battles, especially like, as they're crossing the line and things like that, rather than crossing over to someone waving the flag, but I know why they do it, Yeah. So the first race of the season is done and dusted. We'll be in Portimao in a couple of weeks' time, and I am super pumped. PozzA and I will be covering sort of a preview show where we'll be questioning things like, what are our predictions? Have they changed the gravel yet? And now we'll be here every Tuesday. I know it's a little bit different to what we were used to, releasing on a Monday basically as soon as we possibly could, but I want to at least try to continue to edit these videos, get some cute graphics up, get some clips from, the action up, which if you are watching this in video format, you will have noticed that there actually has been some this weekend. So do let me know what you think. And my beautiful dog Lewis is just coming up to me, demanding my attention. So I'm going to wish you all a wonderful week. If you enjoyed, like and subscribe, and we will see you all next Tuesday.